Welcome to American Common Sense, a fun look at the state of American politics, inspired by Thomas Paine's Common Sense from 1776, hosted by James Humphreys. Hello and welcome back to another episode. Today I'm going to start with a different George Washington quote than normal because we're going to talk about that wonderful fun thing that's been happening in the United States and all over the world that sent shockwaves to everyone. Tariffs. The president's favorite word, tariffs. He thinks it's the most beautiful word in the dictionary. Just ask him. So the quote I'm going to give you from George Washington is this: "The Constitution of the United States and the laws made under it must mark the line of my official conduct." Again, the Constitution of the United States and the laws made under it must mark the line of my official conduct. I like that a lot because this president is presently trying to stretch and find where the limits of executive authority really are. And as we talk so much about the Constitution, once again, my handy-dandy little pocket Constitution right here, we want to look and see what George Washington's referring to, how it applies to what we're dealing with today, and what we can and cannot do. Again, we're going to be dealing with another example of the legislative branch not doing its job, unfortunately. But we're also going to talk about some key things that are important to the judicial branch today. So let's get started and let's have fun with it. All right? First, in Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, it says, I've got to get there, the very first line, "The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imports, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, but all duties, imposts, and excise shall be uniform throughout the United States." Congress gets to collect the money. That's basically what that says. They collect the money, they pay the debts. Now, the very first question we have to ask is this. The President of the United States, a few months ago, forgive me, I got to use my phone for this because I didn't print all of this out, used something called the International Emergencies Economic Powers Act, the IEEPA, in order to create an emergency based on drug use and illegal immigration trafficking across the borders in order to justify imposing tariffs. So the first question we have to ask is, does that act have constitutional authority? Because Congress is given the right to lay taxes and to collect excises and duties, duties being another word for tariffs. So the first question we have to ask is, does Congress have a right to abdicate its responsibility to set those tariffs to the executive branch in the first place? That is a question that has to be answered by the judiciary, and the judiciary has never really answered that specific question very thoroughly. So we're going to talk about that here in just a second as well. So if we look at the IEEPA, the first thing you notice is I went through and read through a whole bunch of that material already from the early 1970s. It's a law that's about 50 years old. The word duty or tariff doesn't appear anywhere in the statute. So the president using the IEEPA in order to create that tariff seems like an odd use of that particular law. If that law is even constitutional, does Congress have the right to abdicate its responsibility to set those tariffs themselves? Do they have the right to abdicate that to the executive branch? And if they did abdicate to the executive branch on a limited basis and it was legal, found constitutional, then the question has to be asked, does broad-based tariffs, are they applicable in this case or are they not? So for example, the president says that the reason for the tariffs is to stop fentanyl trafficking across the Canadian and Mexican border and for the components of fentanyl to be created coming in from China into Mexico or Canada to create the product to bring into the United States. Well, if that's the case, then adding additional tariffs on things like steel and aluminum, on anyone else across the country or across the globe, India or Great Britain, for beef or for any number of other agricultural taxes from places other than South America or Mexico or Canada where we're dealing with drug use in the first place, does that broad base apply either to that law, or does the president have the right to exercise that power that is reserved for Congress in such a broad way without explicit approval from Congress in the first place? Because remember, it's the president's job to exercise the law that's written. So is there a law written that allows him to do so? And that's a real question that's going to have to be answered by the courts. The challenge is, when we look at that, since that particular act, the IEEPA that he refers to, doesn't have the word tariff or duty in it, it has never been used to collect tariffs or duties. And so I'm not sure what the courts are going to do with that. The challenge is whether or not the courts will even hear this case, because the only person who can bring a suit against the use of the IEEPA would be Congress itself, because they would have to assert that the president is usurping their authority. And as we've seen, and as we've talked about for decades now, even in our own podcast here for the last few episodes, Congress has been extremely sheepish when it comes to exercising its authority and trying to rein in the executive branch. They have been slowly but surely eroding their own power and giving more and more of their power away to the executive branch for decades on both sides of the aisle. Everyone is guilty of this. This particular president, President Trump in his second term, is trying to see the extent of how far he can push the use of executive authority under the Constitution based on what Congress has done. And if Congress, who's the only one that has standing, doesn't sue to protect their own interests, the likelihood is that the judiciary will never get this question put in front of them. And the reason for that is because lower courts, they may agree or disagree, but the reality is that the Supreme Court may say that no one other than Congress has standing because only Congress's power is being hurt by an abuse of the executive in that situation. There may be an effect that hurts other people, that hurts other countries, that hurts certain industries or certain unions, but those are side effects of the act. They're not direct effects. And so the question would be, will the court even allow a suit from someone other than Congress to proceed in the first place? Which brings me to that judiciary thing I wanted to talk to you about real quick, which is the number one mistake the judiciary makes. Every single case, they make this mistake. And they've made this mistake almost since the founding of the country. They did well for a few years, and then they came back to trying to do well. But primarily since the progressive era through to today, the Supreme Court has had a very specific set of things. They determine two things. They determine if something is legal from statutory requirement, and they determine if something is legal on the merits from a constitutional point of view. But the reality is the U.S. Supreme Court's primary responsibility is to make sure that the laws that are passed are constitutional. So their first and primary responsibility, in my opinion, which I'm just sharing my opinion here, is they must always determine the constitutionality of a question before they even decide if they're going to hear the case or not. It doesn't matter whether someone has standing or doesn't have standing. It doesn't matter if the question is good or bad, or if it will have massive implications or not have implications. The question has to be asked, is the question that's brought before the court constitutional or not to begin with? If it's not constitutional, you throw it out and you're done. If it is constitutional, then you determine whether or not you want to hear the case based on what is presented to you in front of you. For example, the case that right in front of us with tariffs. Someone is going to sue saying that the IEEPA is not an appropriate use of authority for the executive branch to use to create tariffs that are broad-based and global and meant to have major economic impacts when they have nothing to do in places like India or Pakistan or Germany for the creation of fentanyl, which is the declared emergency in advance. Now, what has typically happened over the last 100, 120 years is the court would say, well, you don't have standing, so we don't have to answer the question. It's their way of skirting the issue and getting out from underneath it. They might be able to skirt it, but they really should answer the first question, which is, well, is that constitutional or not? The question is asked, does the IEEPA relate to, is that a constitutional law in the first place? It would be inappropriate for the court to answer the question of whether or not the executive branch should or shouldn't use it before answering the question of whether it's constitutional. So the court should come out with a constitutional determination first and explain why they believe the law is or isn't constitutional. And if they determine that it is constitutional, then they can decide whether or not they want to hear the case or not hear the case based on other legal maneuvers like standing and so forth. But they should always have to answer that question, whether it's constitutional or not, in order to give appropriate and clear instructions to Congress as to what they should or shouldn't do and where the limits of their power is or is not. That also gives the executive the same shot across the bow, as it were, in this particular case, where a determination is made to either justify or nullify what they're doing, so that if they might not take that case, they know that another case may come forward if the leadership of Congress changes and they decide to defend their own position. It's clear, based on what's happening right now, that Congress has absolutely no intention of defending their own position and their own power as granted in the Constitution. It is abhorrent to me, and it should be abhorrent to you and to everyone in this country, no matter your political persuasion. It should be abhorrent to you that the Supreme Court might try to duck the question, or that Congress might not do its due diligence and defend its own powers granted under the Constitution. As a conservative, whether we agree or disagree, we want things to be done by the law. And as a liberal in this country, if we see damage being done and an abuse of power, we want that abuse reined in. So no matter which way you look at the coin, everyone in this country has a vested interest in ensuring that the separation of powers and that the three branches of government are treated as co-equals and that one branch is not subservient to another. Tariffs are a good thing. They apply. Duties and that show up in the Constitution everywhere. That's a real constitutional thing to do. The question is it being used in the way that it should be used? And that's going to be a challenge for this particular administration, because the Supreme Court did do something that was on the right trail a few years ago. Back in 2022, here's yet another little note, in the West Virginia versus EPA, the court found something called the court created, I should say, something called the Major Questions Doctrine, which in essence states that for a federal branch of government, an administrative district, whether it's the EPA, whether it's the Department of Housing and Urban Development, no matter what it is, whichever agency that exists in the executive branch, they can't find new, novel uses for how language is written in order to circumvent Congress's authority to set statute. They have to interpret the statute more narrowly. And the Major Questions Doctrine requires that the agency show that whatever rule or regulation they're putting out has a direct correlation to the law with which they are attempting to apply it. Because remember, the executive branch's job is to apply the law as written by Congress. So what that basically translates to is that those branches need to not find a new way of interpreting things 50 years after legislation has been written. And so since that case came down in 2022, and that case is moving in the right direction, it is not the executive's job to interpret what Congress has written. It is the executive's job to do what Congress has written in a fairly literal sense. It's appropriate then that Congress should regularly be reviewing multiple issues in order to see if there are updates that need to be made to existing law as technology or situations or society changes. Congress has a bad habit of saying, we addressed this issue once, we don't have to address it again. But that's not an accurate portrayal of what has to happen. Technology changes, questions change, societal needs change. As we become more aware of what's happening around us, the law has to adapt toward that, and it has to do so in a way that is constrained by our U.S. Constitution. So when it comes to how tariffs work today, we have to ask ourselves, is the IEEPA that was used in this case a constitutional law? I would submit that it probably isn't. And I would also submit that the likelihood is that if Congress decided to defend its prerogative to issue those tariffs on its own, then they would have a right to do so, and they would have a case to take to the court. But I would also suggest that if this Congress wants to support this president, then their job is to pass the tariffs the president wants and give him direct authority to manage those tariffs himself. If they choose not to do so, then once again Congress is abdicating its responsibility and the executive branch is left twisting in the wind. And we need to place appropriate pressure on the legislative branch to do its job and not be angry at the executive branch for trying to test the water and find out where the limits of executive power are. I hope this has been helpful. I hope this makes common sense. I hope this helps you to direct your energy in trying to find a way to respond positively or negatively to this particular issue. Please leave your questions, suggestions, or comments in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. We will see you in the next one.